Before we turn to today's business, I want to take a moment to honor our former colleague, Congressman Doug LaMalfa. For nearly a decade, Congressman LaMalfa served on this committee, and he was a very valued and thoughtful member. He was a lifelong farmer, which is something that we had in common, and with that came a sharp understanding of the needs of rural Americans. As a California member and chairman of the House Western Caucus, it is no surprise that wildfires were always at the very top of his mind. In fact, he was our go-to member when it came to FEMA wildfire issues. Just last month, the House passed legislation which contained language to provide the Clean Water Act permitting relief to firefighting agencies. As a committee member, he was also a mainstay in the biennial Water Resources Development Act process and fervently fought for his constituents' water needs. On the rail and highways front, he was a leading advocate against overburdensome state regulations, and he made this committee a better place, and his tireless advocacy for rural Americans will be missed as we continue our work to address our transportation and infrastructure needs. I now want to recognize Rick to say a few words as well.
Thank you, Sam. I just want to echo Sam's comments about our colleague, Doug LaMalfa. So I knew Doug as a strong advocate for his constituents in the 1st District of California. He always knew where he stood on issues here. He was very clear about that, and that earned him my respect and the respect of the committee members. So this committee, we will miss his presence. I can assure you that. I know that's going to be the case, and we'll miss his bipartisan efforts to help rural Americans as well. My condolences still are with his family, and with that, I yield back.
I'd like to take just a moment to have a moment of silence to honor our friend Doug. Thank you, everyone. And with that, let's turn to today's committee business. Pursuant to Committee Rule 6F and House Rule 11, Clause 2HF, the chairman may postpone further proceedings today on any question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment in which a recorded vote of the yeas and nays is ordered. I'd ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's meeting. Without objection, that is also so ordered. All bill and amendment texts have been distributed electronically, and paper copies are also available here in the hearing room. As a reminder, the committee may use an electronic voting system for any requested votes. So today, the committee is considering an amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7084, the Defending American Prosperity Abroad Act, 2026, an amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6744, the Military Air Traffic Control Transition Act, an amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6618, the Wildfire Aerial Response Safety Act, an amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2247, the Pilot Certificate Accessibility Act, and an amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2474, the Expanding Appalachians Broadband Access Act. Finally, I'd ask unanimous consent for the committee to use an amendments roster for any items under consideration by the committee today. Without objection, that's so ordered. Our first item for consideration is H.R. 7084, the Defending American Prosperity Abroad Act of 2026, and I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation from further consideration of H.R. 7084. Without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize Mr. Mann to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
Designate.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7084, offered by Mr. Mann of Kansas.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered as a base text for the purpose of further amendment. I now recognize Mr. Mann for 5 minutes for his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of H.R. 7084, which imposes serious consequences on foreign governments who steal land from Americans. The bill gives the President the authority to limit the entry of vessels that call on foreign ports, harbor, or maritime terminal wrongfully taken from Americans by a government in our hemisphere. This amendment in the nature of substitute clarifies the requirements needed to lift the entry limitations imposed in the underlying bill. This legislation is an important step we can take to protect American industries and build upon the efforts of the Trump administration to support American companies. Specifically, this legislation ensures the property rights of American companies are protected abroad, a crucial component for both economic growth and our national security. I urge all members to support this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too, and Ranking Member Larson, I too would like to add my voice in support of the Defending American Property Abroad Act, H.R. 7084. This legislation strengthens our ability to respond when foreign governments unfairly seize or nationalize property owned by U.S. persons, especially without fair compensation. The bill would look to identify foreign ports, harbors, marine terminals where American-owned property has been expropriated or taken without due process. Once identified, goods loaded at those facilities and passenger vessels serving them may be restricted from entering or operating in U.S. ports. This provides a clear, lawful, and targeted response when our trading partners fail to honor their commitments. The Defending American Property Abroad Act is about fairness, accountability, and preserving the trust that underpins international commerce. Unfortunately, we do not have to look far for examples of why this legislation is needed. In recent years, an American-owned company, Vulcan Materials, invested in port and terminal infrastructure in Mexico in good faith, under the expectation that its property rights and contracts would be respected. Instead, the Mexican government took actions that resulted in the seizure of that port facility, despite long-standing agreements. This was also despite Mexico being one of our closest trading partners under a free trade agreement. That is not what good faith partnerships look like. Trade should not be a race to the bottom. It should support good paying jobs, protect labor standards, and strengthen communities. And it should be grounded in mutual respect, where countries that benefit from access to U.S. markets also respect the rights of workers, investors, and communities tied to that trade. This bill reinforces that principle. It makes clear that when rules are broken, the United States will respond in a targeted and responsible way. Just like I have been willing to call out unfair practices by foreign governments, I have also spoken out when our own government, including under President Trump, has imposed blanket tariffs without rhyme, reason, or strategy. Again, the Defending American Property Abroad Act takes a measured approach. It targets specific facilities tied to unfair actions and strengthens enforcement tools that protect jobs, supply chains, and communities. I urge my colleagues to support this bill. I yield back.
Mr. Zell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this legislation, which was introduced by Congressman Pfluger. This bill imposes consequences to countries specifically in the Western Hemisphere who steal land from American companies and claim it as their own. When that happens, the United States should no longer recognize any vessel that uses that stolen port, harbor, or marine terminal. Under this bill, the President may limit entry into the United States from vessels that call on a foreign port, harbor, or marine terminal from the Americans, stolen from the Americans by a South, Central, or North American country. Going forward, any vessel that stops at that port, harbor, or marine terminal may be barred from entering or operating in United States navigable water or transferring cargo in any United States port. If that country pays full value for that property or returns it, the designation can be removed and access to our ports and waters can be reinstated. This legislation penalizes and holds countries responsible for their actions. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back my time.
Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to voice my opposition to this bill for several reasons. First, as written, the bill seeks to benefit a corporation currently pursuing ICSID arbitration by pressuring a government to withdraw environmental measures it has already adopted. Why should this committee insert itself before that process or other legal disputes are finished. Second, consider the far-reaching implications of the authority granted to the president per this bill. It gives the president the authority to prohibit vessels that travel through Western Hemisphere ports that he designates from entering or operating in U.S. waters. So although the bill is framed as addressing a specific project in a specific country, the bill grants the president broad authority that could be applied to other countries in the future and which could be exploited to serve his rogue foreign policy agenda, regardless of political party. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the bill ignores the objections of local people fighting for their right to safe drinking water and a surrounding environment free of contamination. Indigenous communities in Torres de la Paz have witnessed and felt the environmental damage caused by these mining operations. This bill fits this administration's playbook. Allow the companies to do whatever they want abroad, no matter the environmental impact or the lives harmed. It limits foreign governments' authority to adopt measures that protect its communities and its environment, especially coercing those foreign governments to prioritize the interests of U.S. corporations over its people. We should not be legislating on behalf of any single company's interests, especially when litigation is ongoing. We should not be granting the president a new authority that could have broad foreign policy implications. I urge my colleagues to join me and to vote no on this proposal. I will be asking for a recorded vote on final passage. Thank you.
Mr. Rouser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the Defending American Property Abroad Act. This legislation upholds a simple principle. American property rights shouldn't stop at our borders. A foreign government, or to put it a different way, a foreign government can't simply seize an American company's property and then continue doing business with the United States as if nothing happened. So this is about defending property rights, protecting U.S. workers and investors, and reinforcing a rules-based trading system. So I want to thank Congressman Pfluger for his great work on this. I urge my colleagues to support the bill. I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the bill? Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7084? Hearing none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7084. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is adopted. The question is now on adoption and favorable reporting of H.R. 7084 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The gentleman requests to record a vote as previously announced pursuant to Committee Rule 6F. Further proceedings on the question will be postponed. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 6744, the Military Air Traffic Control Transition Act. And I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Aviation from further consideration of H.R. 6744, and without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration without objection. The first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize Ms. Gillen of New York to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
Please designate.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6744, offered by Ms. Gillen of New York.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered as a base text for further amendment. I now recognize Ms. Gillen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My bipartisan legislation, the Military Air Traffic Control Transition Act, co-sponsored by our colleague, Mr. Mann, offers a common-sense solution to critical workforce issues facing our aviation system. The United States is facing a serious aviation workforce challenge. At the end of last year, the FAA employed 6% fewer controllers than it did in 2015, and thousands short of the FAA's target. In 2023, an internal Department of Transportation report found that 20 out of 26 critical FAA facilities, including TRACON N90, which is in my district on the South Shore of Long Island, had staffing levels below 85% of the FAA's target. These shortages not only lead to delays and cancellations, they put the safety of our airspace at risk. At the same time, our nation is home to some of the most highly trained aviation professionals in the world. Men and women who have served or are serving now in the United States military. Many of them are performing air traffic control and aviation safety functions every day at the Department of Defense facilities. Yet too often, when these professionals seek to transition to civilian roles at the FAA, they encounter unnecessary barriers and unclear pathways forward. My bipartisan legislation would direct a joint working group with the representatives from the Department of Transportation and the Department of Defense to identify these barriers and report to Congress with concrete recommendations to streamline the transition and help reverse this workforce shortage. I am so proud to have worked across the aisle with my colleague, Congressman Tracy Mann from Kansas, on this legislation, and I'm equally proud to have worked in consultation with the FAA Managers Association and NACDA, organizations representing the frontline professionals who keep our skies safe day in and day out. Mr. Chairman, in closing, this bipartisan bill represents a common sense, thoughtful solution to the serious problems that we are facing in our aviation system. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back.
Thank you. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I'd like to thank Representative Gillen and Representative Mann for their leadership on this important issue, which is building our nation's air traffic control workforce. As has been pointed out, the legislation continues the bipartisan work on the work of this committee last Congress when we created the Joint Aviation Employment Training Working Group in the FAA reauthorization of 2024. The working group is tasked with providing advice and recommendations on improving transitions between the civilian and military aviation workforces. The legislation simply directs the working group to increase its focus on air traffic control occupations. I commend President Trump and Secretary Duffy for prioritizing the need to grow our air traffic control workforce. This legislation is going to assist those by identifying the pathways that will help the government retain highly skilled air traffic controllers and facilitate their transition to the Federal Aviation Administration. I'd urge support for the legislation. I now recognize Ranking Member Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support the ANS to H.R. 6744, the Military Air Traffic Control Transition Act, bipartisan legislation that Representative Gillen and Representative Mann introduced. As this committee works to modernize the nation's air traffic control system, we have to continue to prioritize growing the FAA's workforce. The bipartisan 2024 FAA reauthorization law is a blueprint for the critical reforms needed to do just that. For instance, that law established a joint Department of Transportation and Department of Defense working group to improve the recruitment, training, and retention of U.S. military and civilian aviation workforces. The ANS to H.R. 6744 gives this working group another specific task to identify any barriers for civilian ATC specialists and training instructors employed by the DoD seeking to transition into relevant roles at the DOT. The bill also directs the joint working group to consult with union representatives to develop recommendations to improve this transition. A robust and skilled aviation workforce is critical to ensuring the safety of the flying public, and this legislation is an important step to meeting the staffing demands of our evolving airspace. And I want to thank Representative Gillen for leading this legislation, as well as the FAA Managers Association and NATCA for their organization's support. And I encourage my colleagues to support the ANS to H.R. 6744. I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next one. Thank you, Andrea.
That's all right.
Thank you.
We all do it. Does anyone else wish to be heard? Seeing no one, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6744? Seeing none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6744. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is adopted. The question is now on adoption and favorable reporting of H.R. 6744 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and H.R. 6744 as amended is agreed to and offered favorably reported to the House, and ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 6618, the Wildfire Aerial Response Safety Act. I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Aviation from further consideration of 6618. And without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize Mr. Carson of Indiana to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
Designate.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6618, offered by Mr. Carson of Indiana.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered as a base text for further amendment. I now recognize Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Larson. H.R. 6618, the Wildfire Aerial Response Safety Act, introduced by Representatives Bynum, Crane, Neguse, and Siscomani, is bipartisan legislation that calls for the FAA, in consultation with the U.S. Forest Service and the Department of the Interior, to study the effects of drone incursions on federal wildfire suppression efforts. According to the National Interagency Fire Center, there were at least 34 drone incursions into active wildfire suppression areas last year, 29 of which forced aerial firefighting to be grounded and significantly delayed critical response efforts. Whether these drone disruptions are intentionally malicious or the result of uninformed operators, they are a costly nuisance to federal wildfire suppression efforts and needlessly risk the lives of first responders and law enforcement. That's why I'm very pleased to offer H.R. 6618, which requires the FAA to evaluate the number of drone incursions over the previous 5 years, appraise the costs of such incursions to the federal government, assess feasibility and effectiveness of educational outreach materials, and also deploying approved counter-UAS systems to detect and mitigate against drone interference, among other key considerations. Although she's not on our committee, I'd like to thank Congresswoman Bynum for her leadership on this important and potentially life-saving legislation. I encourage our colleagues to support this legislation. Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member. I yield back.
I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I am very proud to support this bipartisan common sense legislation that requires the FAA to, in coordination with its federal partners, to conduct a study and produce a report on the effects of unmanned aircraft systems incursions on wildfire suppression efforts. Federal, state, and local responses to wildfires are dynamic and require sanitized airspace to ensure rapid response and ultimately the effectiveness of an operation. We've witnessed firsthand the negative effects that UAS incursions can have on wildfire aerial responses last January during the Pacific Palisades fires, when an unauthorized UAS flying within a temporary flight restriction struck the wing of a fixed-wing Super Scooper aircraft, endangering the life of the pilot and causing more than $65,000 in damage. I'm intimately familiar with this problem. I had a very, very near miss at the Sea Island, Georgia Air Show. It wasn't a wildfire restricted airspace, it was air show restricted airspace. And there was an unauthorized UAV in the air taking photographs and nearly collided with the aircraft that I was on the perch waiting for my turn to do my act in the show. This is a huge problem and it's getting worse. I would urge my colleagues to support this legislation as it deals with wildfire situations, and reserve the balance of my time. Recognize Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chair, I support the ANS to HR 6618, the Wildfire Aerial Response Safety Act. This is bipartisan legislation introduced by Representative Bynum, Crane, Neguse, and Siscomani. According to the National Interagency Fire Center, between January and September of last year, there were 34 drone incursions into areas where wildfire suppression aerial operations were taking place. Of those incidents, 29 disrupted or risked those aerial operations. Since firefighting aircraft must be grounded if an unauthorized drone is spotted, such drone interference delays response times and risks lives. Therefore, the ANS to HR 6618 requires the FAA, in consultation with the Secretary of the Interior and Agriculture, to study the effects of these UAS incursions on wildfire suppression. Specifically, the study must, among other things, assess the number of incursions over the previous 5 years, appraise the cost of these incursions, and evaluate whether it would be feasible and effective to distribute educational materials or deploy approved counter-UAS systems to detect, prevent, and mitigate against drone interference. With this information, we can then work to mitigate the negative impacts of these incursions on firefighting activities. I want to thank Representative Bynum for leading this effort and encourage my colleagues to support the ANS to HR 6618. With that, I yield back.
Eric.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to lend my support to this bill, but also I think we can, reasonably anticipate, today it's a wildfire out west, or it's an air show that you've participated in. Tomorrow it could be a tornado in my district or a flood in someone else's, and you have these increasing access to cheap, inexpensive drones that amateurs are flying out of a voyeuristic interest that's really putting our aviation safety at risk. And I think if we can anticipate the likelihood of what this study is going to find, I think we ought to be working on a parallel track of how we're then going to solve and attack the problem. One way I think we can do that is to hold people personally responsible as if they themselves had been in the position that the drone was in. We took on that legislative effort when I was in the state legislature in Michigan because we were seeing the early effects of some of this drone incursion on public airspace, protected areas, prisons, and other things. And if we hold people accountable for their own decisions, their own behavior, as if they were in the place of that drone, I think it would have an effect on hopefully reducing this while we work on counter-UAS technology in the meantime. But happy to support this bill today. Thank you, sir.
Does anyone else wish to be heard? Seeing no one, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6618? Hearing none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6618. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is adopted. The question is now on adoption and favorable reporting of H.R. 6618 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And H.R. 6618 as amended is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 2247, the Pilot Certificate Accessibility Act. I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Aviation from further consideration of H.R. 2247. Without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize Mr. Rouser to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk to offer on behalf of Mr. Burchett.
Please designate.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2247 offered by Mr. Rouser of North Carolina.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for the purpose of further amendment. I now recognize Mr. Rouser for a statement.
I thank the chairman. I'm proud to support H.R. 2247, which was introduced by my colleague from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett. When a inspector asks to see your credentials, a digital copy has all the information that they need. However, and not surprisingly, the FAA is living in the past by still requiring pilots to carry physical copies of their certificates. In today's world, there's no reason why we can't allow pilots the option of presenting a digital copy of their certificates. This bill requires the FAA to digitize their airman certificate systems and get with the times. Very simple, straightforward bill. I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back.
I recognize myself for a statement, and I would like to thank Representative Burchett for introducing this legislation, for his leadership on the issue. For as long as I can remember, I've always been required to carry a hard copy of my pilot certificate. It's no secret that the FAA is often behind the times when adopting any new technology. However, in this digital age, it's time for the FAA to join the 21st century and allow digital options for airman certificates. Anywhere we can safely lower barriers, allowing people to more easily exercise their freedom to fly, I am very supportive. Allowing pilots the option to carry digital copies of their certificate in lieu of paper copies accomplishes that. In the Federal Aviation Administration Reauthorization Act of 2024, we required the FAA to digitize processes. This is an incremental step in digitizing their system to the benefit of all others. So I would urge support for the legislation. I recognize Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I support the ANS of H.R. 2247, the Pilot Certificate Accessibility Act that Representatives Burchett and Mann introduced. Current law requires pilots to carry physical versions of their certificates in case a representative of the FAA ever needs to verify the status. The introduced version of 2247 sought to provide pilots with a digital option for verification, initially allowing for photographic facsimile to serve as proof of certification. Citing security and authenticity concerns, however, the ANS to HR 2247 improves upon the idea and places necessary guardrails on the type of digital certificate, specifically allowing pilots to use a digital certificate that is issued by the FAA so long as it can be authenticated and verified. By allowing pilots to use a digital certificate in this way, we'll continue our efforts to safely and securely modernize the FAA. I want to thank the sponsors for working to get this bill put together and encourage the colleagues to support the ANS. That I yield back.
I now recognize the bill's sponsor, Representative Burchett, for a statement on his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. I have trouble hearing out of that ear. I assume the Ranking Member was in support of that bill. Briefly.
Despite half of the prime sponsorship, I am.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. No more truthful words have ever been spoken until after I get finished with this. Mr. Chairman, thank you, brother. Airmen are still required to carry paper copies of their original medical certificates and pilot license. The FAA says this requirement is primarily due to concerns about the potential for forgery. The FAA seems counterproductive, but anyway, the FAA already maintains secure electronic records of these certificates. The Airman Certificate Accessibility Act allows pilots to present digital certificates issued by the FAA administrator during inspections. It also allows airmen to continue to present physical certificates if they choose, providing flexibility while ensuring security and compliance. So either or. The FAA must issue regulations implementing these changes by November of 2028. The aviation sector remains burdened by outdated practices in an era of rapid technological advancements. This common sense legislation takes a step towards modernizing the industry, enhancing convenience for airmen, and aligning FAA processes with the 21st century standards. I urge my colleagues to support the Airman Certificate Accessibility Act, and I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the bill? Seeing no one, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2247? Hearing none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2247. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is adopted. The question is now on adoption of favorable reporting of H.R. 2247 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. In opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and H.R. 2247 as amended is agreed to and favorably reported to the House without objection. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. We have one more bill left, and then we have a recorded vote. So let your members know that we're going to be voting here pretty quickly, and we're going to leave the board open too, so folks, because I know we got a lot of markups going on all over. today, so we'll leave the board open for a while so folks can get in here and get voted.
Can I clarify, are you going to recess it all, or we're just going to move the vote and leave it open?
I think we'll just do the vote and leave it open.
Okay, thank you.
Our next item for consideration is H.R. 2474, the Expanding Appalachia's Broadband Access Act. I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management from further consideration of H.R. 2474. And without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration without objection. The first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. And I recognize Mr. Taylor to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
Please designate.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2474 offered by Mr. Taylor of Ohio.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered as a base text for the purpose of further amendment. I now recognize Mr. Taylor for 5 minutes for a statement.
Thank you, Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson, for allowing me to speak in favor of my bill, the Expanding Appalachia's Broadband Access Act. Broadband access should not be determined by the region in the United States you live in. Unfortunately, many rural Appalachian communities lack the necessary infrastructure to connect to the modern economy due to mountainous terrain, making it difficult and costly to build infrastructure to provide internet service. The lack of broadband directly impacts many of the communities in the district I represent, from struggling to attract businesses to their community to preventing access to telehealth services. The lack of broadband can set entire regions back. As co-chair of the Bipartisan Rural Broadband Caucus, I was proud to introduce this legislation to help address these challenges that have hindered broadband growth for decades, and I remain committed to advancing additional legislation to strengthen broadband access in southeastern Ohio and other Appalachian and rural parts of our country. My bill would direct the GAO to conduct a comprehensive study reviewing whether satellite broadband can help boost economic development within the Appalachian Regional Commission. With satellite broadband showing massive potential in recent years, the United States government should take an all-of-the-above approach when providing broadband services, especially when these new technologies could save taxpayer dollars and get people connected now, not in 10 years. This bill is meant to help expand satellite broadband access in Appalachia and create additional opportunities for broadband access in Southern Ohio. This will not only help boost the economy, but it can also help keep people in rural America. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this legislation to help communities served by the Appalachian Regional Commission obtain the necessary broadband service needed to connect with the modern economy. And with that, I yield back.
Recognize Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I support the ANS to 2474, the Expanding Appalachia's Broadband Access Act, this legislation that Representative Taylor introduced. This bill requires the Comptroller General of the U.S. to conduct a study on the capability of the Appalachian Regional Commission to include low-orbit satellites in broadband projects. This study, conducted by the GAO, will assess whether these low-orbit satellites can meet business needs, evaluate the economic development growth in areas already utilizing low-orbit satellites, and analyze the cost-effectiveness of implementing broadband via satellites. By directing GAO to study this issue, Congress can help ensure that small businesses and residents in rural and Appalachian communities can benefit from emerging technologies and continue developing economically. I support this bill and urge my colleagues to do the same, and with that, I yield back.
I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to thank Mr. Taylor for his work on this and his leadership on this bill. The ANS to H.R. 2474 would direct GAO to study the capability of the Appalachian Regional Commission to cover satellite broadband projects. Specifically, the bill would direct the GAO to examine whether satellite broadband has the capacity to support businesses and economic development in distressed and rural areas. So last Congress, language from my eBridge Act was passed as part of WRDA 2024, and that legislation removed the barriers to communities' access to economic development funding for broadband projects, which would attract jobs. Representative Taylor's bill recognizes the need for more options for broadband access and is going to give us the information needed to assess the cost effectiveness of satellite broadband services. I'd urge my colleagues to support the bill. With that, I yield back. Does anyone else wish to be heard? Seeing no one's, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2474? Hearing none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2474. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is adopted. The question is now on adoption and favorable reporting of H.R. 2474 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and H.R. 2474 as amended is agreed to and offered favorably reported to the House without objection. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. We'll now move on to postponed votes. Our only vote is the final passage of H.R. 7084 as amended, which was agreed to by voice vote. Is a recorded vote still requested? Yes, a recorded vote is still requested. Members will record their votes using the electronic voting system. So we're just going to leave the board open so you all can vote and go back to whatever it is you need to do. I know it's a super, super busy day, and so Rick and I are just going to leave the board open for a while so folks can get in and vote. With that, the chairman intends to vote aye.
Ranking will vote no.
Open the board. All right, thanks, everyone, for coming. Have all members been recorded who wish to be recorded? Does any member wish to change their vote? Hearing none, the clerk close the vote and announce the total.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there are 36 yeas and 22 nays.
By a vote of 36 yeas, 22 nays, the bill as amended is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. All right. Thank you all for participating. Anybody that's left, I'd ask unanimous consent that each measure ordered reported today be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, incorporating any amendments adopted, and without objection, that is so ordered. I'd ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make all necessary technical, clarifying, and conforming changes to each of the measures ordered reported today to reflect the actions of the committee, and without objection, that is so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 22, Clause 1, I'd ask unanimous consent that the chairman or his designee be authorized to offer such motions as necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on the legislation adopted today or any similar measure. Without objection, that is so ordered. I'd ask unanimous consent that the chairman, after a consultation with the ranking member, have authority to strike or revise any provision of the measure ordered reported today that would cause a sequential referral to another committee or would cause the bill to be subject to a Budget Act or Rule 21 cut-go point of order. And without objection, that is so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I'd ask unanimous consent that all members of the committee have at least 2 calendar days in which to file any supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views on the legislation adopted today. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to Rule 6 of the Rules of the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure, I note the presence of a quorum for the actions taken on all committee business today. And with that, the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure has completed its business. The committee is now adjourned.